I chose Black Man in Contemporary Society because I'm a black man in contemporary society, and I should really get a chance to learn about what's going on and how it affects me. And so far the class is really good because I've learned a lot about particularly stereotypes and how roles have been applied to black males and how we've basically just fed into them, and it's helping me to understand what's going on with myself as it relates to contemporary society.
This particular course is certainly relevant because, one, I am a man of African descent, and two, I think I'm very familiar with the history of Africa, America, and so I bring to the table, I think, a unique perspective, not because of those two reasons, but because that I think I try to bring to the students first the historical understanding of how diasporic African men or African-descended men got to this point of contemporary period. And in other words, what makes them contemporary, and therefore how to understand and interpret their contemporary realities by looking at a historical backdrop of men like them and the challenges they face. And then therefore, I think we can have really informed discussion about what is contemporary life like, and what are the opportunities, what are the pitfalls, what are the constraints of African-descended manhood in North America. I begin the class structurally by looking at some of the historical kinds of African men. That is, those who were well-known and not so well-known, those whose speeches we know and don't know, those whose lives have been recorded for posterity, and those who could not read their records. And so I try to give a range of men, a range of lives, fathers, husbands, freedom fighters, collaborators, and the like, betrayers even. And then look at these as a composite. And I think that's the best way to see African American life, as a composite, rather than a kind of singular kind of people or a singular monolithic vision of them. And I think by looking at them in terms of a composite, then we can, I think, look at the variety, but also the shared experiences of African descended men. And then therefore, when we come to the present tense or the contemporary period, then we can make sense of those realities as they unfold.
The in-class lectures or discussions are pretty much the most beneficial pieces that I find beneficial. I think that the roles, we discussed the 4 roles of black men in society and how the roles for black men were created, and that basically was the most touching piece to me, because my family consists of a lot of men, and it's odd when you see that everybody in your family falls into one of these stereotypes.
I don't really impose my definition of manhood on the class. Actually, what we do, there is a document called a Standards for Evaluating and Defining African American Manhood. And that document, is at the end of the class, where the students and I will kind of look over the long haul, what we have done, and then, based on our readings, our discussions, our film and video, and other materials, what are the important, standards or criteria. So there are several categories. One category is education. Another category is family, community. Another category is masculinity, to your question about how we define the either flexibility or the rigidness of manhood. And so we actually as a class come to our own standards and we discuss them. And so the idea is that in the class, a student will leave the class having a very clear sense, based upon our discussions, our readings, what that manhood entails. And again, the idea is a composite idea. We do talk about religion. In fact, there's an article that you might have seen on the e-reserves that focuses on the black church. So there are readings, matters of fraternity, for example. We focus on that, particularly black fraternities. Employment does come into the focus as we move more into the contemporary, I guess so-called modern period. Now we're more so in the late 19th century going into 20th century, and then from there we'll focus on more of the contemporary matters where employment becomes an issue, because in the period that we're discussing now, employment was really a moot issue. You had talking about captive labor. So they weren't really employment per se, and then even during the sharecropping period, or kind of debt peonage period, employment was not really an issue as it is today in terms of wage laborers. And so as we move into the contemporary period, I think you can kind of anticipate that we will focus more on that. But because I didn't note that in the syllabus doesn't mean it's not there. In fact, it is there. But many of these areas, as you know, they intertwine. For example, in matters of law, you know, the legal restrictions, the legal world, you know, have been in many ways, you know, a main, you know, problematic for African American men in particular. I mentioned the industrial complex built around prisons, O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, all these, I think, you know, speak to issues of identity as well. So I think the, you know, main focus of the course on compositeness of this all will speak to these different areas, even though the syllabus may say that.
There are a lot of females in the class. Sometimes it's harder for them to really relate to what's being said because, you know, it's coming from a perspective that only it really can be understood if you're a male. So they have a difficulty with that, I feel. But ultimately, I think that everybody in the class understands, you know, the material and gets where it's coming from.
I really haven't been surprised as yet. Now, I don't know what's in store next few weeks, next few months actually, before the semester closes. But thus far, no, it hasn't been much surprise. As I mentioned to you, I think, off camera, that, you know, some of the students, you know, they're not on the same page, and some have voiced commentaries as if they should be. And, you know, I think what's not been surprising, but I think is going to be a challenge in this class as more classes is, you know, to move students from dogma, to move students from, you know, their own particular way in which they see the world to kind of broaden perspective. By broader, I mean not simply accepting other people's ideas, but being open to the possibility of those ideas. And so that's a challenge I would imagine in other classes as well. But in my classes, in this class in particular, Black Man in Contemporary Society, you know, moving the students from that and then moving us to, again, being on the same page. Not that we have the same perspective, but that we have the same kind of reference point, you know, general ideas, concepts, general idea about these historical figures and not so historically known figures, and then be able to come to our own determination. That's really the goal of the course, to come to an informed perspective, you know, based upon activities, our films, our discussions, and, you know, the rigors of our writing and the like that we have for the class. And then hopefully that kids will be on the same page.
With Professor Konadu's classes, the thing is that if you come in to learn, you will gain a perspective that you probably can't get anywhere else. You know, so it's definitely great in terms of development of self. You will always walk out learning something new. You know, like I come into that class every single day. It's actually my favorite class. You know, I come into that class every single day because I know that every single day I'm going to walk out with something different. He doesn't give you a biased perspective. The information is always out there, and it's information. I want to really dive back into community, maybe start with mine, and help people who feel like they're victims feel like they're empowered instead. You know, help people find that identity and get back in touch with themselves and where they come from and who they actually are. I'd rather major in history. I learned that from studying Malcolm X, that if you don't know your history, then you basically don't know anything, and you can always be lied to. So I'd rather gain a better understanding of the past and where I come from. Sociology, because it's a study of people, you know, and I've spoken to people who study psychology, and they've told me that I'd be better off with sociology, being that I'm thinking on a broader scale, as opposed to just focusing on individuals.